In the quiet mountains of the Midwest, a war-worn mechanic and his loyal dog stumbled onto a secret that had been waiting for decades. A forgotten bus, hidden deep in the forest, held the truth about a lost family and the daughter who grew up believing she had been abandoned. What would you do if a single discovery could rewrite an entire life? And how far would you go to return a stranger past to them? Today, you will follow Daniel and his faithful dog Rocky as they carry a burden of truth up a mountain and bring healing back down. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. Morning light filtered weakly through a dull gray sky as the city stirred with distant engines and hurried footsteps. The weather was cool enough to bite at exposed skin, and the air carried a faint smell of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. It was a quiet beginning to another long day in a neighborhood that rarely offered comfort to anyone searching for peace. Daniel Walker sat on the edge of his narrow bed, inside a small rented room that had once been part of an old boarding house. At 40 years old, he looked older than his age, in the tired way a man does after carrying too much weight for too many years. He had a lean build, shaped by military life and the rough physical work he had taken since returning home. His shoulders were still broad, but his posture held a slouch, as if gravity pulled more heavily on him than on others. His face was angular, with a strong jaw, sun-worn skin, and dark stubble that he kept trimmed only when he remembered to. His eyes were a deep gray brown that once held sharp alertness, but had grown shadowed and distant from years of sleepless nights. Those eyes often carried a haunted look that he tried to hide from the world. He rubbed his temples slowly as the ghost of last night's nightmare lingered. The memory of gunfire in dusty valleys returned in flashes, and the echo of explosions pulsed faintly in the back of his mind. Afghanistan had carved marks in him that no one could see, but he felt every day. He breathed out slowly, willing the tension to leave him for a moment. The room around him was cramped with peeling paint and worn wooden floors that creaked under the slightest movement. A small table in the corner held only essentials: a dented metal coffee mug, a cheap alarm clock, and a folded stack of overdue bills he had not yet found the courage to open. A single window looked out at an alleyway filled with trash bins and tangled power lines. The building was old and ragged, but it was all Daniel could afford on a mechanic's salary that never covered everything he needed it to. He had fallen behind on rent twice, and his landlord had warned him sternly the last time they spoke. The aging man had a voice roughened by cigarettes and impatience, and Daniel always felt a prickle of shame when forced to admit he needed more time to pay. Near the foot of the bed, Rocky lifted his head slowly and looked at Daniel with warm, amber eyes. Rocky was a 4-year-old German shepherd with a powerful build and a thick double coat of black and tan fur. His ears stood tall, and his posture, even at rest, carried a natural alertness that made him look like a guardian standing watch. Daniel had adopted him from a rescue shelter 2 years earlier, after hearing that the dog had been abandoned by a previous owner who moved away without warning. Rocky had arrived timid but loyal, and Daniel recognized in the dog the same kind of quiet hurt he himself carried. The bond between them had formed instantly, and had only grown stronger as they survived the lonely months together. Rocky stretched his long body across the worn floor, then walked toward Daniel, pressing his cold nose against Daniel's hand. Daniel felt the familiar comfort spread through him like warmth in winter. He rested his hand gently on Rocky's head, moving his fingers through the thick fur. Rocky's presence softened the hardness inside him. The nightmares did not end, but waking up to the steady breathing of his dog gave him something to hold on to, a reason to try again each day. Daniel stood up and changed into his work clothes. His jeans were faded and frayed at the edges, and his dark shirt carried old stains from oil and grease that never fully washed out. At the mirror above the small sink, he splashed water on his face, running his fingers through his short brown hair streaked with early gray. He did not linger. There was no time for vanity in his life. He moved with the quiet determination of someone who had learned long ago to survive by keeping his head down and doing his job without complaint. As he prepared to leave, Rocky nudged his leg again, as if sensing the heaviness in him. Daniel gave a faint, tired smile. "You are the only one who gets it, buddy," he murmured in a low voice. The dog leaned into him, offering silent understanding only a loyal companion could give. That small moment steadied Daniel enough to face another day. Outside, the neighborhood streets were already loud with the pulse of the city. Cars rushed past with impatient horns, and the chatter of people blended into a restless background noise. Daniel disliked the noise deeply. Crowded places tightened something inside him, and sudden sounds often sent his heartbeat racing. He never told anyone because he knew most people would not understand. They would say the war was over, and he was home now, and everything should be fine. But Daniel felt that the war lingered in him like smoke trapped in a closed room. He walked Rocky down the block, allowing the dog to stretch before he headed to work. Rocky trotted proudly beside him, head high, tail steady eyes, scanning the surroundings with natural confidence. People who passed them often moved aside, not out of fear, but out of respect for the strength and dignity in the dog's posture. A few neighbors greeted Daniel politely, though not many knew his story. Daniel always replied with a small nod, not wanting to extend the conversation. He had grown used to staying quiet around others. Talking meant taking off the armor he had built around his emotions, and he no longer knew how to be open with strangers. After the walk, Daniel brought Rocky back to the room and filled his bowl with food. Rocky ate, while Daniel grabbed the last half of a cold sandwich from the fridge for himself. He could not afford a better breakfast, but he had learned not to care. As long as Rocky ate well, Daniel felt he was doing something right. The auto shop where Daniel worked was a 20-minute walk away. The shop owner, a heavy-set man named Carl, with a gruff voice and little patience, often assigned Daniel to the hardest jobs. Daniel never protested. The physical labor kept his mind busy, and the constant motion gave him less time to fall into memories he wanted to forget. But the pay was low, and unexpected bills came often, and his debt crept higher each month. Sometimes at night, he would sit in the dim room staring at the stack of bills, wondering how a man who once led soldiers through desert valleys now struggled just to keep his lights on. Daniel reminded himself that Rocky needed him. That thought alone pulled him out of the spiral many nights. Rocky was the one being who looked at him, not with pity, but with trust. Daniel carried that responsibility like a shield. On the walk to work, he passed familiar storefronts and cracked sidewalks. The morning bustle grew louder the closer he got to the main road. His steps were steady, but inside he felt hollow. The city did not offer him rest. His mind often drifted back to moments of the war, moments that returned without warning. A flash of sunlight on metal, a distant boom, the sound of boots running through dust. He shook his head, as if that could push the memories away. By the time he reached the auto shop, the day had officially begun. Cars lined the street waiting for service, and the sharp smell of oil hung thick in the air. Carl waved him over, already frowning. Daniel braced himself for whatever the day would bring. Even so, as he worked, he carried one thought with him, like a quiet pulse. Tonight, Rocky would be there, waiting, tail-wagging eyes bright and steady. That small certainty was the only peace Daniel had found in a long time. And though he would never say it aloud, it was the only reason he was still standing. A pale afternoon sun hung behind scattered clouds, and a thin wind brushed along the street, carrying dust and the low hum of passing cars. The temperature was mild, but held the edge of coming rain, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline rising from the busy road. It was the kind of weather that settled uneasily on a tired mind. Daniel Walker stepped out of the auto shop with slow, heavy movements, as if each step required deliberate effort. His body ached from the long week, and his clothes smelled of motor oil and burned rubber. The exhaustion in his face was sharper today. Shadows beneath his eyes deepened from another week of sleepless nights and constant tension. His jaw clenched unconsciously as he replayed the sound of his boss yelling at him earlier that morning. Carl had shouted in a voice thick with frustration after a simple mistake Daniel made when replacing a part. Carl was a large man with thinning dark hair and a flushed face. His temper had always been quick, and today he had been red-faced with anger. Daniel had stood there silently, with the weight of guilt pressing down on him, even though he had been working nonstop without rest. He knew he had made the mistake because his hands were trembling from fatigue, but admitting that felt like weakness. So he simply listened until the shouting ended. When he finally left the shop, he carried with him a hollow heaviness that no amount of walking could shake off. His mind churned with thoughts of failure and disappointment. He had tried so hard to keep up, but lately every small task felt like lifting a mountain. The pressure of debts, the pressure of expectations, and the quiet pressure of memories from the war merged together like a slow, tightening grip around his chest. He took one long breath, trying to steady himself. Across the street, his old pickup truck waited. It was a faded red model from decades earlier, with peeling paint and dents from years of use. The engine rattled loudly each time it started, but Daniel kept repairing it himself because he could not afford anything better. As he approached the truck, he saw Rocky sitting inside the passenger seat. The dog lifted his head, ears perked up, eyes warm and attentive. Rocky was a sturdy German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat and a calm, steady posture. His amber eyes always seemed to read Daniel's emotions before he even spoke. The sight of the dog waiting for him softened something inside Daniel. He opened the door, and Rocky gently nudged his arm, then pressed his head against Daniel's chest. The silent greeting felt like a lifeline. Daniel knew he needed to leave. He felt an overwhelming urge to escape the noise, the pressure, and the claustrophobic feeling of failure. He needed air that tasted clean, not mixed with exhaust fumes and deadlines. He needed silence that did not trigger old memories, but soothed them. So with a deep breath, he made the decision that had been tugging at him for days. He would take a few days off. No pay, no approval, but he did not care anymore. Peace mattered more. He climbed into the driver's seat and ran a tired hand over his face. He whispered more to himself than to Rocky. "We are going away for a bit, buddy." Rocky responded with a low, soft bark, then placed his paw gently on Daniel's thigh, as if agreeing. That small gesture grounded Daniel enough to start the engine. The truck coughed and shook, but finally rumbled to life. As he pulled away from the curb, he felt a tremor of relief. The city streets blurred behind him, while Rocky curled up on the seat beside him, keeping his head close enough to nudge Daniel whenever his mind drifted into darker thoughts. The farther they drove from the city, the lighter Daniel felt. The noise faded, replaced by stretches of open road and distant hills that promised quiet refuge. But the escape was not easy. The truck engine sputtered 3 times within the first hour. The temperature gauge climbed too high at one point, forcing Daniel to pull over and let the engine cool down. He stepped out of the truck and opened the hood, letting the warm air escape. The smell of heated metal filled his lungs, but strangely, he preferred it over the smell of endless city grime. As he worked, Rocky stayed beside him, head lowered and tail still, as if sensing the tension. Daniel tightened a loose hose, wiped sweat from his forehead, and whispered a quiet plea for the truck to hold together long enough to reach the mountains. When they got back on the road, the fuel indicator hovered just above empty. Daniel swallowed hard. Money in his wallet was barely enough for supplies, and certainly not enough for a full tank. Each mile felt like another step across a fragile bridge that might collapse beneath them. He clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles grew pale. Fear and worry pressed against him, but beneath it, something stronger stirred the desperate need for space to breathe. The mountains on the horizon looked like a doorway to peace, and he was determined to reach them no matter what. Rocky stirred beside him and leaned across the seat to lick Daniel's hand. The gentle touch broke through Daniel's anxious thoughts like a warm light cutting through fog. He glanced at Rocky, seeing the calm strength in the dog posture. Rocky had always been steady, unwavering loyal, in ways Daniel did not always feel he deserved. The dog had been abandoned, once left in a shelter, with no explanation. Daniel knew how that felt. Perhaps that was why they bonded so deeply, 2 beings trying to rebuild something inside themselves. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky a soft amber glow as they drove closer to the mountains. Trees grew thicker along the roadside, and the air cooled with each passing mile. Daniel lowered the window, letting the crisp wind brush against his face. His heartbeat slowed just a bit. The road still stretched long and uncertain ahead, but the air felt easier to breathe. The truck sputtered again briefly, but then smoothed out. Daniel murmured a quiet thank you to the engine. He promised himself that if they made it safely, he would repair everything properly when they returned. For now, all he wanted was a place where sound did not echo like gunfire in his mind. Somewhere he could sit beside a small fire and feel the earth steady beneath him. As evening approached, the mountains rose tall and dark against the fading sky. The sight stirred something old and familiar inside Daniel, something like hope. He reached over to touch Rocky's head. The dog lifted his gaze and wagged his tail, once slow and steady. "We are almost there," Daniel said in a soft, tired voice. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. Rocky rested his head on Daniel's lap, and the warmth of his presence settled deeply into Daniel's heart. Whatever waited for them in the mountains, Daniel was certain of one thing. He was not facing it alone. The afternoon sky above the mountains was softened by thin clouds drifting slowly across a pale blue backdrop, and the air carried the cool scent of pine and damp earth. A calm breeze brushed gently across the clearing, where Daniel had set up his small campsite, and the faint sound of a stream nearby blended into the quiet rhythm of the forest. It was the kind of peace he had longed for through countless sleepless nights. Daniel Walker knelt beside the small fire pit he had built earlier. The flames burned low and steady, giving off a faint warmth that soothed the tension in his shoulders. He felt calmer than he had in months. After reaching the mountains, he found a spot near a narrow stream whose clear water flowed over smooth stones with a soft, continuous murmur. The trees around them stood tall and still, offering protection and a sense of shelter he had not felt in a long time. For the first time since leaving the city, Daniel felt something like control returning to his breath. Each inhale felt deeper and steadier, as if the air itself was helping him repair the fractures inside him. His old truck rested nearby, and beside it, Rocky stretched comfortably on the soft ground. The German Shepherd had settled into the wilderness easily. Rocky's thick coat of black and tan fur glowed faintly under the afternoon light, and his ears twitched every few seconds as he listened to the forest. He looked alert, but at ease, lying with his paws crossed and his eyes scanning the clearing calmly. Daniel watched him and felt a slow wave of gratitude. Without the dog presence, the weight of solitude might have pressed too heavily on him. Rocky made the silence feel like a companion rather than a threat. Daniel dipped his hands briefly into the cold stream, letting the chill numb the ache in his fingers. The simple act felt cleansing. He looked around, taking in the tall trunks covered in patches of moss, the scattered patches of sunlight falling across the ground, and the smooth stones lining the bank. This place felt untouched and timeless. It gave him the sense that the world could slow down for him, if only for a moment. But the forest calm did not last. As Daniel reached for a piece of firewood, he noticed Rocky posture shift. The dog ears rose sharply and his body stiffened. His amber eyes narrowed toward a thick wall of trees at the far edge of the clearing. At first, Daniel thought Rocky had hurt a small animal, but the tension rippling through the dog's muscles felt too intense for something ordinary. Before Daniel could speak, Rocky released a low, deep growl that vibrated through the stillness. Daniel's heart quickened. He stood slowly, trying not to startle the dog or whatever had caused the reaction. A familiar instinct rose in him, the same alertness that had kept him alive during patrols overseas. He followed Rocky gaze into the forest, but saw nothing but shadows and thick branches. Daniel whispered softly, hoping to calm him. "Easy, boy." Rocky did not relax. His growl deepened. Then he turned his head briefly toward Daniel, barking once sharp and urgent. The message was unmistakable. "Follow me." Before Daniel could respond, Rocky sprang forward, plunging into the dense line of trees. Daniel called out, but the dog paused only long enough to look back, bark again, and continue moving. Panic rose in Daniel's chest. The forest was vast, and the undergrowth thick enough to swallow a dog if he ran too fast or too far. Daniel grabbed his jacket and hurried after him, pushing through branches that scraped against his arms. Rocky left a clear path of disturbed leaves and broken twigs. Daniel followed quickly, breathing hard as he tried to stay close. The peaceful sound of the stream faded behind him, replaced by the rustle of branches and the pounding of his own heartbeat. The forest grew darker as he moved deeper under the canopy, where sunlight barely reached the ground. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead and kept moving. The urgency in Rocky behavior gnawed at him. Something was out there, something the dog wanted him to find. After several minutes of climbing, the terrain began to rise. The slope was gradual at first, then steeper, forcing Daniel to brace himself on tree trunks as he pushed upward. He felt his breath shorten, but he refused to stop. Rocky would not lead him off without reason. The dog had the instincts of a protector, and Daniel trusted those instincts more than he trusted his own judgment sometimes. Finally, the dense trees opened slightly, and Daniel caught sight of Rocky ahead. The dog stood still at the edge of a narrow, overgrown track. His tail was raised, but not wagging, and his body leaned forward in a tense, alert posture. Daniel stepped beside him, bending over to catch his breath. When he looked up, he understood why Rocky had reacted the way he did. Before them lay what remained of an old service road. The track stretched upward along the slope, but nature had reclaimed nearly all of it. Tall grass hid the gravel beneath, and thick roots coiled across the ground like veins. Shrubs and young trees had grown through the cracks, creating a tangled barrier that made the road almost invisible from the clearing they had left. If not for Rocky, they would have never found it. Daniel stared at the road with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He wondered what it had once led to, and why it had been abandoned. Roads did not simply disappear without reason. Something about it felt forgotten, as if the forest had been swallowing it for years without interruption. Rocky barked again, urging him onward. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but the dog determination pushed him forward. They followed the path, slowly stepping over fallen branches and pushing aside thick vines. The trail curved gently upward, and the air grew cooler as they climbed. Daniel felt a strange tightening in his stomach, a sense of anticipation mixed with apprehension. The old instincts from his deployments returned, making him hyper-aware of every sound. Then, the road ended. It did not fade away, but stopped abruptly, as if cut in half by time. At the end of the track sat a large abandoned vehicle, almost completely hidden by layers of moss leaves and creeping vines. It took Daniel several seconds to process what he was seeing. It was a bus. A large camping-style bus, built decades earlier, now resting at a slight angle, sinking slowly into the earth beneath it. The metal surface was eaten with rust, and the windows were coated with grime. A carpet of fallen leaves covered the roof, while vines clung to the sides like fading scars. Daniel stepped closer, drawn by a mix of awe and disbelief. The vehicle looked as though it had been frozen in time. It was impossible to tell how long it had been here, but the forest had nearly erased its presence. Only the shape remained, telling the story of what it once had been. Rocky stood beside him, silent now. His earlier urgency softened into a steady, patient watchfulness. Daniel placed his hand on the cool metal of the bus side, feeling the rough texture of years gone by. Something about the sight sent a long, quiet shiver through him. He did not know who had brought the bus here or why it had been abandoned, but standing before it, he sensed a story buried beneath the layers of dirt and moss. The forest around them fell into deep silence, as if waiting for him to take the next step. A soft gray light filtered through the forest canopy as afternoon drifted toward evening, and the air inside the trees felt cool and heavy with the scent of moss and damp leaves. A gentle breeze whispered across the branches above, while the clearing around the abandoned bus remained still and quiet, as if holding its breath. It was the kind of silence that made even small movements feel louder than they should. Daniel Walker stood before the bus entrance with Rocky beside him. The dog ears twitched forward, and his posture was tense but focused. The closer they came to the door, the more Daniel felt a tight pressure growing inside his chest. He sensed that whatever waited inside was important, even though he could not explain why. The discovery of the forgotten road had already unsettled him, and now the bus itself felt like a doorway into someone else's past. He reached out and pushed gently against the metal frame of the door. Rusted hinges groaned in protest as the door swung open enough for him to step inside. Dust rose faintly in the stale air disturbed by the movement. Daniel hesitated at the threshold, trying to steady himself. His heart beat faster than he expected. The dim light inside made the details difficult to see at first, but he could tell immediately that the interior was nothing like the outside. Time had damaged many parts, but it was clear the bus had once been a place someone tried to turn into a home. Daniel stepped carefully onto the metal floor. The faint smell of old wood and forgotten cloth lingered in the air. As his eyes adjusted, he saw the outlines of a small living space built with care. On the left stood a wooden table fashioned from thick planks that had been sanded smooth, even though age had now worn the edges. A single chair sat beside it, its legs uneven from years of use. Above the table hung a faded photograph taped to the metal wall. The picture showed a man, a woman, and a young child smiling brightly into the camera. Their simple happiness seemed almost out of place in the abandoned interior. It struck Daniel harder than he expected. He paused, staring at the faces. The man had a strong jaw and short hair. The woman had gentle features and shoulder-length dark hair, and the child stood between them with a wide grin, and small hands clutching both parents. Daniel felt a faint ache in his chest. These people had lived here at some point, and the bus had held the echoes of their lives for years without anyone knowing. Further back inside the bus, he noticed two bunk beds built from sturdy wooden frames. The top bunk had a blanket that had faded almost white, while the bottom bunk was covered in dust and pine needles carried in by the wind through a cracked window. A small stuffed toy lay near the lower bunk. It was once a brightly colored animal, but time had dulled its fabric into muted tones. The sight of it made Daniel think of the innocence that must have once filled this space. Rocky padded forward, cautiously sniffing along the floor. His nose moved from the table to the bunks, then paused near the wider bed toward the back. This bed looked like it belonged to the adults. Its mattress was thin and torn, but still intact enough to show where two people might have slept. Rocky lowered his body and sniffed again with more intensity. His ears flicked backward slightly. Then he dug a paw at the wooden boards beneath the bed. A low growl rumbled from his chest, not out of warning, but urgency, as if he sensed something hidden there. Daniel moved quickly to Rocky's side. He crouched down, placing his hand on the dog back, feeling the tension rippling through him. He studied the wooden floor and saw that one of the planks near the foot of the bed did not sit flush with the others. The edges lifted slightly, and small cracks ran along the grain. It looked worn in a way that did not match the other boards. Someone had used it often long ago. Using his fingers, Daniel pried gently at the edge of the board. Dust scattered as he pulled it free, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. His breath caught for a moment. Hidden inside the compartment sat a metal box about the size of a toolbox. It was dark green with worn edges and faint scratches across the surface. The metal was thick and cold to the touch, and the lid was sealed tight as if meant to protect whatever was inside from moisture and time. He lifted the box carefully. It had weight which surprised him. Rocky watched closely, his amber eyes fixed on the object. Daniel carried the box to the table and set it down. A knot tightened in his stomach as he examined it. This was no ordinary storage tin. It resembled a secure personal safe, the kind used for storing valuables or important documents. The latch was stiff but unlocked. He pressed it lightly, and the lid opened with a soft metallic click. Inside the box lay a collection of items that seemed almost too delicate to belong in such a harsh environment. Neatly folded at the top were several letters written on yellowing paper. The envelopes showed signs of water damage along the corners, but the ink remained legible. Beside the letters rested a stack of documents bound together by a brittle ribbon. On the top page, Daniel could make out the words "life insurance," though the rest was difficult to read due to fading. Below the stack was another set of folded papers thicker than the rest. When Daniel touched them, he recognized the structure. It was a will, the kind of document filed when someone wanted to ensure their family future, even in the worst circumstances. This copy, however, looked unsent and unsigned by any official authority. It was as if someone had prepared it, but never delivered it to the correct office. Finally, at the bottom of the box lay a small diary, bound in cracked leather. Its pages were yellowed and curled at the edges. Daniel lifted it gently, feeling the fragile weight of it in his hands. He could sense the presence of a story inside a story that had been locked away for years under the wooden boards of the bus. He ran his thumb across the cover slowly. Something in him shifted a mixture of sadness, curiosity, and a quiet respect for whoever had lived here and left these pieces behind. He looked around the bus one more time. Every detail, the simple table, the bunk beds, the photograph on the wall, and the toys scattered on the floor added to the quiet truth that this was not just a vehicle. It had been a home, built with effort and care. The people in the photograph had laughed here, cooked here, slept here, and left marks of their daily lives. Now, only dust and silence remained. Rocky moved closer and rested his head against Daniel's leg. It grounded him, pulling him briefly out of the heaviness of the discovery. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth of the loyal companion who had led him here. Without Rocky, he might never have found this forgotten place and the story hidden inside it. Daniel closed the lid of the box, but did not seal it. He felt the weight of its contents, not just physically, but emotionally. Inside were fragments of someone's life placed with care in hopes that someday they might matter to someone. That day had finally arrived, though the burden felt heavier than he had prepared for. The bus around him remained still. A quiet home held in place by time and memory, waiting for the moment when its story could be uncovered. The late afternoon sky hung low, with a blanket of pale clouds drifting slowly over the mountains. A cool wind moved through the trees and carried the scent of damp soil and old pine needles. The quiet around the abandoned bus felt heavier than earlier, as if the forest itself was waiting for whatever Daniel would discover next. Inside the bus, Daniel Walker sat at the wooden table, with the metal box open beside him. Dust floated in slow circles through the dim light, leaking in from a cracked window. His hands rested on the stack of papers and the worn leather diary he had found beneath the loose floorboard. His breath felt shallow, as he turned the first few pages again. Each line carried the voice of the family who once lived here. Each sentence painted a picture of days filled with hope until those days turned harsh and desperate. The diary belonged to the father. Daniel could tell from the handwriting that the man had been disciplined and precise. The lines were neat, the words carefully chosen. One passage revealed he had once been a soldier, a detail that struck Daniel deeply. The thought of another man, a generation before him, facing a fight inside his own mind, echoed Daniel's own struggles. He imagined a man hardened by service, trying to build a peaceful life inside this bus surrounded by wilderness. He imagined the weight of the responsibility he must have felt. Another section described the mother. She had grown weak and feverish during a severe winter storm. The diary said she had dark hair and a slender build with a soft and patient nature. The father wrote about how she kept smiling for their daughter, even when her health was fading. She was taken away by a rescue helicopter when conditions worsened, leaving behind the father and their little girl in the middle of a storm. The words carried fear, hope, and helplessness all at once. The next pages described the daughter. She had been small and bright, with light hair that caught the sun whenever she played near the stream by the bus. The father described her laughter and how she drew pictures on the walls to make their home feel warmer. When the storm turned violent, she was taken to relatives for safety. The father had stayed behind trying to protect what little remained of their life. Daniel closed the diary slowly and stared at the metal box again. He picked up the remaining documents. They were official forms that had grown brittle with time. Insurance papers with large numbers printed on them. Papers describing compensation that had never been claimed. A will that had never been filed. With each page, he felt a cold tightness forming in his chest. The family had lost everything, and yet the world had forgotten them so completely that the money meant for them sat untouched for decades. His thoughts began to twist. The practical part of his mind whispered about his own debts. He thought of the overdue rent of the bills piling on his small desk, of the nights he had gone to bed hungry so he could buy proper food for Rocky. The money in the box could lift all of that from his shoulders. It could change his life entirely. No one knew about the bus. No one knew about the documents. No one except him. The thought grew heavier and colder as it settled into his mind. Daniel felt the old ache of being invisible in a world that rarely offered help. He thought of the times he had returned from deployment only to find himself lost in a life that did not welcome him. He thought of the many days he felt abandoned by the same world he had once risked his life to protect. He pushed the papers away and stood. His pulse raced with a mix of temptation and shame. He tried to breathe, but the air felt tight, as if the bus itself was pressing against him. The forest outside remained quiet, offering no answer. Rocky moved near the entrance, sniffing along the ground. The dog tail flicked once, then he walked toward the back of the bus, where Daniel had found the hidden compartment. Rocky began circling and sniffing again, more urgently this time. Daniel watched him carefully. Rocky Paws dug lightly at the dirt floor near the metal frame, and then suddenly his hind legs slipped on the loose soil. The dog fell to the side with a startled yelp. Daniel's heart lurched as he rushed over. Rocky tried to stand but favored one front leg. There was a scrape along the paw where he had landed on a sharp stone. Daniel knelt beside him, gently lifting the paw to check the injury. It was not deep, but enough to sting. Rocky whimpered softly, then leaned into Daniel's chest, trusting him without hesitation. Daniel held him close, running a steady hand through the thick fur, trying to calm the dog. The simple trust in Rocky's eyes pierced straight through the turmoil inside Daniel. In that moment, the weight of his thoughts crashed over him. He saw clearly the path he had been considering: keeping the money, staying silent, choosing selfishness because the world had been selfish to him. But as Rocky leaned against him, Daniel felt something shift inside. He realized he had been on the edge of becoming what he hated most: someone who walked away from others' suffering, someone who let people be forgotten. He swallowed hard as shame tightened in his throat. He looked around the bus again. The toys, the photo, the carefully built beds, the letters left behind. These were signs of a family who had fought to survive, a family who deserved better than to be used as an opportunity. Rocky pressed his head gently into Daniel's chest. The dog's quiet loyalty steadied him. Daniel took a slow breath and felt a small spark of clarity grow in his mind. He could not repeat the world mistakes. He could not abandon a story that had been buried by time. He had been left behind once, and he knew the pain of being forgotten. He would not allow that to happen to them. He stood slowly, still holding Rocky's paw. His decision was clear now. The documents would not be hidden. The truth of the family would not stay buried in the Ur forest. Whatever he chose next would honor them, not exploit them. And for the first time that day, Daniel felt something steady inside him. A quiet but determined resolve. A pale morning light settled over the slopes of the mountain as thin clouds drifted silently across the sky. The air felt cold, with the lingering scent of wet pine and the faint sound of wind brushing through the branches. It was the kind of morning that carried both calm and weight, as if the world expected something difficult ahead. Daniel Walker stood beside his old truck, staring at the metal box, now wrapped inside his backpack. The discovery inside the bus still pressed heavily on his thoughts. The diary, the letters, the insurance forms, and the unsigned will had revealed the truth of a family that had struggled and lost everything in silence. Daniel felt the weight of that silence now. It pushed him toward a decision that he could no longer delay. He needed to take the documents to someone who could understand them, someone who could help uncover the story behind them. He opened the truck door, and Rocky climbed in, carefully favoring the paw he had scraped earlier, though the injury looked minor. Rocky, thick black and tan fur, ruffled slightly in the breeze, and his amber eyes remained alert, watching Daniel with patient trust. Daniel reached out and brushed a hand over the dog head, feeling a brief flicker of comfort. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and turned the key. The engine sputtered hesitantly before catching with a trembling rumble. The fuel gauge hovered close to empty. Daniel knew he did not have the money to refill the tank. Even so, he pressed gently on the pedal and guided the truck down the dirt road leading away from the forest. The descent was slow. Loose gravel shifted under the tires, and the engine groaned as if asking for rest. Daniel's mind was a mixture of determination and worry. He was afraid the truck would stop at any moment, but he also knew he had no choice but to keep going. The story he carried inside his backpack was no longer just forgotten pages. It was a responsibility. The truth belonged to someone still living, someone who deserved to know. An hour later, the road leveled into the narrow valley where a small mountain town sat quietly. Wooden buildings lined the single main street, their paint faded from years of harsh winters. Old signs creaked gently above the storefronts, and a few early risers swept their porches or arranged goods in front of small shops. The town felt still and removed from the rush of the world. Daniel felt uneasy stepping into any place with people, but he forced himself forward. At the far end of the street stood a modest building made from dark timber. A small wooden sign above the door read Public Library and Museum. Daniel stepped out of the truck and opened the passenger door for Rocky. The dog hopped out slowly, then stood tall beside him, scanning the quiet street. Together, they walked toward the entrance. Inside, the air felt cool and smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. Shelves lined the walls, and glass display cases held small artifacts from the town history. Behind a large wooden desk sat an older woman with short silver hair, neatly arranged, and gentle lines on her face. Her posture was straight and confident, showing a lifetime of discipline. She wore thin framed glasses, and her eyes were clear and sharp. Her name tag read Nora Collins. Nora looked up as Daniel and Rocky entered. Her expression softened into polite curiosity. Daniel felt a moment of discomfort under her steady gaze, but stepped forward. He explained quietly that he had found an old bus in the forest and that there were documents inside belonging to a family who once lived there. He spoke carefully, trying to keep his voice steady, while Rocky sat calmly at his side. Nora listened with full attention, her brows drawing together slightly. She had the calm, thoughtful presence of someone who had spent years preserving stories no one else remembered. When Daniel handed her the diary, she held it carefully, as if it were something fragile. She adjusted her glasses and read the first page. Her breath caught faintly as she recognized the dates. She asked Daniel to wait while she walked toward a shelf filled with binders and folders. She moved with surprising energy for someone her age, flipping through old records with practiced hands. Nora explained that part of her work was tracking families who once lived near the mountain during earlier decades. She studied the names in the diary again: the father, the mother, the daughter. Her expression began to change as a thread of memory surfaced. After several minutes, she turned to Daniel with a solemn look. She said the girl had survived. Her name had appeared in old census notes and a record from a social worker years ago. The files showed that the daughter had been raised briefly by distant relatives and later moved often between rental homes. There were notes from schools indicating she believed her parents abandoned her. She had grown into adulthood carrying that story without knowing the truth. Nora searched through another drawer until she found a faded envelope containing recent addresses. The most current record listed the name Lisa Moore. Nora described her as a woman now in middle age, living in a worn-down apartment complex only a few miles from town. The brief description Nora had found stated that Lisa kept mostly to herself, worked long hours at simple jobs, and rarely spoke of her past. Daniel listened quietly. A heavy ache settled in his chest. The idea that someone had lived their entire life believing their parents left them behind struck him deeply. He thought of the diary waiting inside his backpack. He thought of the lines the father wrote with hope that someday their daughter would be safe, that she would know the truth. Nora handed back the diary gently and placed one hand on the counter to steady herself. She told Daniel that stories like this did not appear often. Most were lost forever in the dust of forgotten years. She thanked him for bringing the documents instead of walking away from them as others might have. Daniel nodded. though he felt overwhelmed. Rocky leaned into his leg, sensing the tension. Daniel rested a hand on the dog head, grounding himself. The next step was clear now, even if difficult. He had to find Lisa Moore. She deserved to know. She had lived long enough in the shadows of a story that never belonged to her. The quiet room around them felt suddenly full of purpose. The truth had finally taken its first step out of the forest. A soft afternoon light spread across the small valley town, while a thin breeze drifted along the quiet streets, carrying the dusty scent of late summer. The sky was pale, with only a few slow-moving clouds, and the air felt calm, but heavy, as if the day held something long delayed and deeply important. Daniel Walker rested one hand on the steering wheel of his old truck, trying to gather the steadiness he needed for the next step. Rocky sat in the passenger seat, his thick fur brushed by the wind, blowing through the open window. His amber eyes stayed fixed on Daniel, as if reminding him to breathe. Daniel took a slow breath and looked at the slip of paper in his hand. Nora Collins had written the address with her careful, tidy handwriting. This was where Lisa Moore lived, a woman who had spent her life believing her parents had abandoned her, a woman who had no idea that the truth had been buried on a mountain for decades. The truck rattled slightly as Daniel turned into an aging apartment complex. The building was a long row of dull brick with peeling paint and rust around the metal stair railings. Weeds grew through the cracked concrete walkways. It was a place shaped by years of low wages and forgotten stories. Daniel knew the feeling well. He felt Rocky lean closer, as if sensing the tension that tightened Daniel's shoulders. They walked together toward the second floor. The hallway was narrow and dim, with flickering lights that hummed softly. Daniel stopped outside a door, marked with a fading number. For a moment, he could hear only his pulse. Then he knocked gently. The door opened a small distance, a thin chain still latched across the frame. A woman stood behind it, her posture wary. Lisa Moore was in her mid-40s, with tired brown eyes and dark hair pulled back loosely. Her face carried the softness of someone who had once been hopeful and the shadows of someone who had learned to expect little. Her skin was pale, and her hands held the edge of the door, as if she were used to bracing herself against the world. She asked in a quiet, guarded voice if she could help him. Daniel introduced himself slowly and kept his tone calm. He explained that he had found something in the mountains, something that might belong to her family. Lisa's expression shifted. She closed the door long enough to undo the chain, then opened it wider. Rocky sat politely at Daniel's side, watching her with gentle curiosity. She stepped back, allowing them to enter. The apartment was small, dimly lit, and plainly furnished with second-hand furniture and soft, worn blankets. A faint scent of detergent and old books filled the air. There were no framed photos on the walls, no signs of a past displayed anywhere, as if she had never believed she had a story worth keeping. Daniel sat down carefully on the edge of a faded chair and opened his backpack. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted out the diary, the letters, and a small photo of 3 smiling people who had once lived in the bus now, resting on the mountainside. He placed the picture on the small table between them. Lisa froze. Her eyes widened and a faint breath escaped her as she stared at the image. She sat slowly on the couch, her hands rising to her mouth. Daniel began to explain what he had found: the handmade bunk beds, the toys, the half-written letters, the diary pages describing their struggle through the winter storm. the father words hoping his daughter would be safe, the mother final unfinished letter that held both fear and love. As Daniel spoke, Lisa's shoulders began to shake. Tears filled her eyes until they blurred her vision. When she finally reached out to hold the photograph, her fingers trembled as if she were touching something sacred. She whispered that she had never known. All her life, she had believed her parents had walked away. She had carried that wound like a quiet scar. Now, she understood that they had fought for her until they could not fight anymore. Rocky stepped forward and gently pressed his head against her knee, as if sensing the weight of what she felt. Lisa let out a soft, broken sound, a mixture of grief and relief, and placed one trembling hand on his fur. Nora arrived later, after Daniel called to let her know. She entered the apartment carrying a folder of paperwork, her silver hair neat, and her expression solemn yet focused. She had the calm, determined air of someone who understood the importance of restoring what had been lost. Nora sat beside Lisa and opened the folder, explaining each document carefully. The insurance policy, the signed claim that had never been processed, the will that had never been filed, the forms required to reopen the case, the long process ahead. Lisa listened with tear-stained cheeks, but for the first time in years, her eyes showed a spark of something brighter than sorrow: hope. Nora assured her that she would handle the communication with the insurance company and with the state legal offices. It would be difficult and slow, but not impossible. Someone had finally brought forward what had been missing: the truth. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork calls and verification. Daniel stayed in town taking small repair jobs at a local garage to cover food while he waited for updates. Rocky slept at his feet each night as if guarding him through the uncertainty. At last, the news came. The claim had been approved. The unpaid compensation and accumulated interest formed a sum large enough for Lisa to reclaim her family land, the old farm that once belonged to her parents. When she received the final confirmation, Lisa cried again, though this time with relief. She hugged Daniel tightly, her voice shaking as she thanked him. Daniel felt something warm settle inside him. It was more than gratitude. It was the feeling of having returned something precious to the world. Nora handed Daniel a small envelope containing a modest finder fee processed through the legal office. It was not much, but it meant something. Yet the real reward came in knowing that he had given someone a home and a history that had been stolen by time. When Daniel and Rocky stepped outside into the evening light, Daniel felt lighter than he had in years. Rocky walked beside him, tail high, as if proud of both of them. For the first time, Daniel felt he had not just survived his own past, but had helped someone else reclaim theirs. The late afternoon sun spread a warm golden haze across the rolling hills of the old farm. The light drifted gently over the fenced pastures and the weathered barn, while a soft breeze carried the scent of dry grass and distant pine. The sky above was a wide, calm blue, marked only by slow, drifting clouds that softened the edges of the day. It was the kind of quiet evening that made the world feel steady again. Daniel Walker stepped out of the pickup truck and looked over the land that now belonged to Lisa Moore. Rocky leapt out beside him, his thick fur catching the sunlight and his ears rising with alert excitement. He ran a slow circle, sniffing the ground as if claiming every inch of it. Daniel watched him with a faint smile as the weight he had carried for years slowly loosened. Lisa Moore approached from the porch of the farmhouse with careful steps. She was a woman in her mid-40s, with soft brown hair tied loosely behind her shoulders, and tired but gentle eyes. Her figure was slender, and her pale skin showed the long traces of a life spent working too hard for too little. Yet something new had awakened in her since the truth about her parents had returned to her hands. There was a restored steadiness in her voice and a light in her eyes that had been missing for decades. She greeted Daniel with a warm sincerity as she explained again her offer that he and Rocky move to the farm and help rebuild it. She wanted him to manage the repairs, the fences, the barn, the broken gates, and all the tasks she could not do alone. She insisted that he deserved a stable job with fair pay and a safe place to stay. Daniel listened quietly, absorbing her gratitude, even though he still felt like he had done only what was right. He agreed to move in and began working the next day. The farmhouse was old with weathered wooden siding that had faded to a soft gray. Daniel examined every room, calculating what needed fixing. He replaced the loose boards on the porch, checked the wiring, repaired the sagging steps, and tightened the old railing. His strong hands moved with patience shaped by years of labor. He worked from morning until dusk, finding comfort in the simple rhythm of repair. Each nail, hammered into place, felt like a quiet promise that life could be rebuilt, one piece at a time. Rocky followed him everywhere. The dog had taken naturally to the role of guardian. He patrolled the property with a proud, confident stride, stopping to sniff the corners of the barn or trot along the fence line. His posture was tall, his muscles well-defined beneath the tan and black coat, and his bright eyes seemed to miss nothing. The neighborhood children soon began to visit the farm, drawn by Rocky's friendly presence. They were small and cheerful, most between 6 and 10 years old. They trusted Rocky instantly and followed him across the open fields as he guided them like a watchful protector. In the evenings, Daniel would sit in a large cushioned armchair placed near the window. Rocky, curled beside it, his head resting against the base of the chair, while Daniel read old novels he had carried with him for years. The sound of crickets rose from the fields, and the smell of fresh hay drifted through the open window. The quiet soothed him in a way he had never known in the city. Sometimes Lisa would join him bringing tea and listening to the children laughter outside as the last colors of sunset filled the sky. Each sunset painted the horizon with deep orange and soft purple, reminding Daniel of the lonely nights he had spent wandering with no destination after leaving the war behind. Now those memories felt distant, as if locked behind a door that no longer needed to be opened. When the children gathered near the porch, Daniel would tell them a story. His voice, steady and warm, carried across the farmyard as he told them about the forgotten bus in the woods. He spoke about the soldier who had once lived there and about the family who tried to endure a brutal winter. He told them of the man courage of the mother strength, and of the child who survived, because love had carried her away from the storm. The children listened with wide eyes, their small hands gripping their knees. Rocky sat tall beside Daniel as if guarding the truth itself. Daniel always ended the story by telling them that every act of kindness mattered, and that even the smallest choice could save someone's life. The children nodded solemnly as though they understood far more than their years should allow. In time, Daniel began to understand something deeper. He had brought closure to Lisa's family story, but the journey had given him something far greater. The farmhouse became more than a workplace. It became a refuge, a place where he could breathe without fear, where the shadows of war no longer crept into every corner of his nights, and where the presence of others no longer overwhelmed him. Rocky steadied him every day with quiet loyalty. Lisa offered kindness without expectation. The children brought laughter that washed away the echoes of old pain. The man, who once felt like a wandering ghost, now stood rooted in a community that welcomed him. He woke each morning with purpose, walking the fence lines, feeding the animals, repairing broken beams, and teaching the children how to care for the farm. The work was hard, but it filled him with strength. He no longer felt trapped by his memories. Instead, he felt rebuilt by the land and the people who lived on it. On one quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Daniel stood beside the porch, with Rocky leaning gently against his leg. Lisa joined him, her voice soft, as she thanked him again for bringing her parents' story back to life. Daniel simply nodded. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had finally found a place to rest. Rocky barked once, tail wagging, as if claiming the final word. Daniel laughed, a rare, deep sound that carried across the dusk. The past had once been his burden, but now he walked forward with steady steps. He had a home, a job, a purpose, and the beginnings of a family who chose him without hesitation. For the first time in years, Daniel was no longer running from anything. He was walking toward the future, with Rocky faithfully guiding him through the last of the shadows into the rising light. In the quiet that settled after these events, the story of Daniel, Lisa, and Rocky became more than a tale of hardship. It became a reminder that healing often begins in the smallest acts of courage. A worn diary found in a forgotten bus. A dog that refused to give up. A man who chose honesty over the easy path. Their lives touched one another in ways none of them expected, and through that connection, each of them found strength to stand again. The old farm grew into a place of renewal, where laughter and simple work replaced the weight of old wounds. Children learned that even in the darkest winters, someone had once held hope for a better day. Neighbors began to see Daniel not as a lost soul, but as a man who had found his place by helping someone else find hers. In giving away the truth, he discovered a purpose that money could never provide. And in returning home, Lisa finally understood that love had been protecting her even in the moments she felt most alone. This story carries a quiet message for all who hear it. Life will place storms in our path, but it will also send the right people and the right moments to guide us through. Sometimes a single act of kindness can save a life. Sometimes a single truth can return light to a heart long shadowed by pain. And sometimes the hand of God works through ordinary people, guiding them gently back to hope. As you listen to this journey, may you find comfort in knowing that miracles still walk with us in everyday footsteps. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to pause for a moment and pray that God brings peace, protection, and blessing to your home. Share this message with someone who might need its light. Leave a comment so others know they are not alone. And if you choose to subscribe, you become part of a small community that believes in mercy, compassion, and the quiet miracles that shape our days. May God watch over you and grant you strength for the road ahead.